All right, ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome back once again to the only coast to coast show all about the information economy. It's called Inside Analysis. Yours truly, Eric Kavanaugh here. And we're going to talk about something that is really important in the world of technology, especially in the cloud, something that is somewhat overlooked, I think, or at least underappreciated in terms of its complexity and in terms of the trouble it can cause you if you don't get it right. We're going to talk about security and really passwords and permissions and access to cloud environments and how you can get in there and what different things can be done. And this whole concept of shared responsibility that many of you have heard about, where the cloud providers say, well, we're responsible for our environment, but you're responsible for your environment, including what's inside our environment. So we'll get into some of those details as well. We've got Brendan Hannigan online from Sonrai Security. They have a new offering out. But in general, Brendan, you help folks with security issues. Obviously, security is a very, very broad space, and there are lots of different things that you can do. But I can tell you that I'm annoyed to the end of time with passwords and changing passwords and having all sorts of different passwords. And then, of course, you have like a password key, and you store all your passwords in one place. And then if that get breached, all your passwords are breached. So it's like there are all these different aspects of dealing with security and permissions. And you come up with a very interesting concept, a permissions firewall. So maybe let's just dive right into what you mean by that and what you're seeing in the marketplace and how it works.
Yeah, and what we mean specifically about that, Eric, is it is a solution to help companies get within one click to least privilege in AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud environments, and to do so without disrupting their operations. So that's the sort of quick story of it. The slightly longer view of it is modern applications. So the basis of this new economy which we have are being built in cloud. And so you touch on one thing, which is, of course, security of human beings and how we log into things, whether it be password or passwordless techniques. And that's interesting. But as it turns out, underneath the covers of cloud, it is the smallest part of our problem. And
Really?
what that means is when you're deploying an application into these cloud environments, developers may have access to certain portions of the infrastructure, but the vast majority of roles and rights in these clouds actually belong to something which we call non-people identities. They're basically machine roles and machine identities, which give that maybe virtual machine the right to do something. And that something could be copy data, read data, write data, create another piece of infrastructure, connect to the internet, connect to a direct thing. So it's wonderful. It's amazing, actually. But to kind of bring it full circle, so now it's not just about people. It's under the covers of cloud. It's about this vast infrastructure which we're building our applications with, which is the foundation of everything. All AI built into cloud, all new SaaS applications built into cloud, all new applications are built into cloud. It's not just about people, non-people. And then the other thing, Eric, you said something well, the shared responsibility model. I'll just give you some stats. Across the three major cloud providers, Amazon, Google, Azure, there are 42,000 permissions that are possible to be set across the different services which they have to offer. So just think, I've got 20,000 identities, 42,000 permissions, 300 services. This cloud is amazing. And we've categorized it's 3,000 plus of those permissions are really, really sensitive. In other words, you could have the ability to create an internet gateway. Why is that bad? So now somebody gets into your cloud and they get access to that permission. Well, they can just create an internet gateway and they can send everything out through that internet gateway, bypassing all your security controls. It just shoots straight out of the cloud through that internet gateway. So it's complicated under the covers. There's a lot of responsibility for customers. And unfortunately, it's complex for them to live up to that, to their portion of the shared responsibility because of the scale.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you set the context very well here. 42,000 different kinds of permissions, 3,000 of which are very, very sensitive. I've worked in this industry for a very long time, and I know a lot of smart developers. And one of my favorite quotes was a good friend of mine, Nikolai Menchikov, a Russian, who just joked with me one day right outside the Empire State Building. He goes, "The funny thing about the web is that nobody know how it works. All we know is it works." right? And he was kind of joking, but he's talking about like ports, like all the ports you could open up or
Yeah.
close on a computer and how access can come in. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right? Is in the infrastructure world, there are all sorts of different ways that these machines can talk to each other and connect to each other.
Yes.
And just knowing what they are is half the challenge. Then being able to manage that is the bigger half of the challenge, I suppose. And that's kind of where you're going with this, right? Is there are lots of different profiles and signatures and mechanisms by which machines can talk to machines, and you have to be able to blanket that environment and know how to pull the levers or turn the knobs, right?
It is, and in all, when we all look at it, we look and say, yes, there's a really good security model. But you know what? It's like having a safe with 3,000 combinations, at least 3 to 42,000 combinations. You got to figure out what the number is to make sure that it's safe and actually locked.
Right, right.
And that's really hard scaling problem for customers. The other thing is it's not just machine. So this is when it gets super interesting beyond even the machine to machine. There's people, machine to machine. But now the cloud providers deliver these beautiful services in the cloud. In other words, you can get a database as a service, SageMaker, an analytics app. It's just there in Amazon. You can just use it and you can start creating notebooks and creating pre-signed URLs. And you can do these things with these services. And if you're not aware of all the power that's possible there, you're really, you have a lot of attack surface under the cover of that cloud, just because
Mm-hmm.
you don't know how it's all put together. Exactly what your friend was just saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. And talk to me about when you talk about a permissions firewall.
Yeah.
People understand what a firewall is. It's basically designed to protect you from bad actors who are coming. So it watches out for bots. It watches for people trying to hack through a system with, brute force, for example. A
Yes.
lot of different things they can do. Distributed denial of service attack. All these are different attack vectors, if you will. What did you build in a permission firewall? Is there essentially a matrix of all these possible permissions that you then can dynamically map or align? Get into the weeds a bit with me and how that thing works.
Yeah. And then I'll explain how it works, and then I'll explain why we picked this as a name, actually, because it's a bit triggering. Some people say it's not really a firewall, it's different than a firewall, and I'll explain why I think actually it is a good name. We're super happy with it. So firstly, the matrix is a good way to describe it, by the way. So we understand the usage of sensitive permissions in these environments. And here's a stat.
Hmm.
All of those people are non-people identities. So if we go to a big enterprise, Eric, we're talking about 35,000 roles and identities, and people and things can do things in a cloud. Even in a very small enterprise, when they're using Amazon, there might be a startup, it would be 4,000. That's a
Hmm.
lot. So
Hmm.
that's just basically the scale of what we're talking about. Our long-term history of data shows 92% of those identities have access to sensitive permissions and never, ever use them. Never use them. What does
Right.
that mean? So I gave you one example. They could have a permission that allows them to disable logging. They could have a permission that allows them to create an internet gateway. They could have a permission which allows them to create a piece of compute. It's
Hmm.
honestly, Eric, sometimes you just go, this is crazy, because it is crazy. And so what we need to do, eliminate. So what we do is we basically go in where we can actually look back in history. We look at the usage. We really focus in on these sensitive permissions. We look back on the usage per service, per identity. And then we basically give the customer buttons. And it says, you know what, nobody's using this service. Disable it at this scope. Just disable it here. Yes, somebody's using that service over in that part of your team, but the rest of the team doesn't need it. Boom, click this button. It's gone. They can't get access to it anymore. That's like a huge chunk of attack surface gone. You don't have to worry about it anymore. It's gone. The second thing we do is we will find tens of thousands of unused identities, like literally identities which haven't been used for 90 days up to months and months and months, and they have admin privileges. We quarantine them. We allow the customer to simply say, we're going to take away all the permissions so they can't do anything. And so that's another thing which we do on the firewall. And then the third thing is we discover every entity which is validly using these sensitive permissions, and we make sure we create exceptions. And so now you've got these services which are being used and are using sensitive permissions. We create exceptions, and then we remove the ability for everybody else to use those sensitive permissions. So what happens is you literally click a button, and that 92%, they're gone. They can't touch these sensitive permissions anymore. So that's the foundation of the cloud permission firewall of what we do. And it is like literally to do this by asking developers to fix a role, asking a person to change their permissions is a months-long effort. Nobody gets to do it. It's a
It's a
disaster.
nightmare.
It's a
It's a
total
nightmare.
nightmare. It's all possible in theory, but human
Right,
dynamics and our experience is it's just not happening. And what's our
right.
difference is we can get people up and running and clicking buttons the next one day later, and they can deliver this for at scale very, very quickly. Now, just there's another piece to the permissions firewall, which is beautiful, which is when somebody tries to use a sensitive permission, we have a way of creating a trigger instantaneously, and then we use chat ops that people, developers, and all our people in these companies are using. And it just says, hey, somebody's trying to use this. Do you approve of this? And we're able to give that. They never actually have to know anything about our cloud permissions firewall. They just actually have this workflow where, hey, somebody tried to use this. Approver, boss person, whoever owns this account, do you think that this is okay? And if they think it's okay, they click approve, and it's reprovisioned in the cloud instantaneously. It just happens in seconds or minutes. And what that, nobody has to log into Amazon or Azure. So that's the second component of it. We call that permissions on demand. So it's beautiful blocking, permissions on demand, and that's the foundation of what it is.
That's interesting. And I mean, I know what you're talking about with respect to permissions that are never used,
Yes,
right? Like, I mean, I have WordPress. I've used WordPress
yes,
for years. And I'll look in there and I'll see all these people that have permission to access things. I'm like, well, where did this guy come from? Where did that guy come from? That's for a very, very small company with a couple WordPress sites,
yes,
right? You expand out to an enterprise organization, and oh my God, this stuff is out there everywhere. And I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball at you. Maybe I'm sure you're familiar with Kubernetes and
yes,
what Kubernetes has done to enterprise software because it's containerization. And the best description I heard is that the containers hold like a little tiny system process, basically. So
yes,
what was a monolith in your traditional operating system has now been sharded out into lots of little containers that have this process and that process, and they're ephemeral and they can spin up and down. My theory is that this whole observability explosion we've seen in the data world, in the systems, in the IT world, is largely due to Kubernetes because of how they do things. And yes, it's much more complex, but it's much more scalable. It's
yes.
much more efficient for environments that have peaks and valleys and things of this nature. So it's good in lots of ways, but it's also adding a whole new layer of complexity. Is that layer of complexity part of what causes this situation that you're addressing with these 42,000 permissions and being able to manage that?
Yes, it is. Like you talk about Kubernetes and just having this kind of dynamic infrastructure across a company. And for example, to turn it into real sort of things that people can understand very easily, it's just so you have a permission and a right to create a piece of infrastructure. Actually, it could be to create a Kubernetes cluster or something. It could be to create a Lambda function, a little serverless function. And you go and do that in a region that people aren't using that much. So you happen to have Europe enabled, but nobody's really monitoring Europe that closely. And you just basically spawn that workload in Europe to do a crypto miner in some company's cloud. And you're
Right,
doing a denial of wallet attack on their cloud. You're using their infrastructure and spending their money. So
right.
that's the implications of this. The complexity is the power is just amazing. Like you can go into these clouds and you can do things that previously would have taken us months and years, right? I can
Right.
create a serverless function, which is just a Python script or something, and get it to do analytics on a database and connect in with a service. And it's just so quick to do it. But now you have these microservices workloads essentially that have this massive mesh of interconnectivity. And that mesh of interconnectivity is controlled by the permissions fabric of the cloud. Now,
Right.
the cloud providers give you all the knobs, but what they haven't come back and said, it's just so hard, unless you're at Netflix and you have every single person is an amazing cloud security architect who's getting paid $700,000 a year. Regular businesses cannot deal with this complexity. It's just too
Right.
much. So we come in to try and help with that. And the reason we call it a firewall, Eric, is I actually think, we think automatically sometimes in our business, of the network firewalls, but of course, the firewall wasn't invented by the technology business. The firewall is essentially a divider between good and bad.
Hmm.
I want to have a firewall which is protecting me from bad things which are happening over here, which is when we go into a building, we see it. It's like a wall to protect this thing from burning my house down. So that's our firewall. And we call it this because we believe the most pernicious threats for you in the cloud exist in this permissions fabric, these 3,000 plus and growing really sensitive permissions. That's what we have to firewall for our customers. That's what they must have under control. It is critical. If they don't have it, they've a mountain of attack surface under the covers that they can't fix. And lastly, a network firewall simply can't solve this problem. It's not designed to solve this problem. Inspecting packets and
Right.
inspecting them faster doesn't help you adjust that permission at all. It does nothing.
That's very interesting. And so you built out a matrix that catalogs the different kinds of permissions, and then you come into a client site and you start monitoring and seeing what's happening in there, and you find big open areas of white space that you can close. Like you said,
Yes.
all these things have not even been used. Go ahead and just close them down. This is like, I remember the reason I thought of Nikolai and his comment about the web is because he would talk about how ports could be attacked. And I've actually
Yes.
seen this. I mean, I remember, so it's just funny as an anecdote here, and our first segment is coming to a close in about 2 minutes, but as an anecdote, I to do online radio, which I've been doing now for 16 plus years. For a while, like now I just use Zoom, but for a long time I would have to use different pieces of equipment, gear to separate my voice from the other voice. And what was happening is I called into a radio show one day and I couldn't hear the studio. And I'm like, why can't I hear you guys? What the hell's going on? And I'm trying to troubleshoot this thing and I couldn't figure out anything. And ultimately, I had a little inkling of, I'm going to use my MiFi instead of my cable and just see if that works. So I used my MiFi and it worked. I'm like, all right, that's freaky. What's going on? I called the cable company. I found out they changed some setting for security purposes and they closed some port. And it turns out that's the port that
You were
this
using.
equipment was using to get to me.
Yes.
Right. So I'm like, well, there it is. Like, who the hell would know something like that? Very few people would know about that. I'm just, a tinkerer. So I started playing
Yes.
around to see if I can get around the problem. And I did. I got around the problem. It turns out it was not me at all. It was the freaking cable company that changed something in the architecture. So it's like, that's a big deal. And it's one of these little permissions that you're talking about. It's they shut down some port in the environment, and that happens to be where the information had been going through
And we
before.
can't expect every human being to know every single possible thing. And unfortunately,
That's
when
right.
the scale of this thing is so vast, it's just out of control. So that when companies go in, we can't expect every developer to know what the hell SageMaker is. They don't care. And
That's
they
right.
don't
That's
care. And
exactly.
they
Well,
shouldn't
let's
care.
hold that thought. We'll come right back with Brendan here on Inside Analysis. Stand by. Don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Brendan Hannigan of Sonrai Security. It's Sonrai Security. They have a new permissions firewall, which I think is very interesting. And we've been talking about the complexity of cloud. And anytime you have simplicity on the front end, there's usually a lot of complexity on the back end to create that simplicity. And so now it's very easy for companies to spin up resources in the cloud. I mean, we're in the data space, so the company Snowflake did amazing work in allowing companies to spin up data warehouses very quickly. Then, when the world changes, take that sucker down, change the schema, spin it back up again. In the cloud, they separated compute from storage, which was a really big deal that changed the game in terms of cost structures and processes and all these different things. And lots of companies are going to the cloud. Think of all the software as a service vendors that are out there. I mean, there are tens of thousands of them. There are thousands and thousands just in the marketing space alone. How do these things work? How do they work with each other? How do they connect to each other? That's one of the signs for when something is happening from a security perspective, like single sign-on, for example. So I figured this out early and I was like, okay, I'm going to pick my poison. I did not pick Facebook. I picked Google. I'm going to let
Yeah.
Google manage my access to these environments so I don't have to remember all the passwords. And that's where really rubber meets road, right, Brendan? In terms of when you opt into the single sign-on, now you're saying, okay, I'm going to let Google connect to, like, for example, Zoom. Zoom connects to my Google Calendar so I can send out invites and people can get the URLs. And sometimes it doesn't work for people. Some people say, oh, I can never get in with your click. And it's probably because of some setting on their side or in their environment or something. But that's a pretty interesting moment for many people, that single sign-on. That's kind of what you're talking about, right? They're now managing a big part of that process for me. What do you think?
It is. I mean, if you look at it from in terms of what we deal with on an everyday basis, right? Our ability to sign on to these SaaS applications is just it's critical, and especially, of course, our email applications. And so, single sign-on is a good example where it's taken that burden off of you And the question is, who will you trust to do that? Google's a good one to
Mhm.
trust. They
Mhm.
spend a lot of money making sure they spend almost effectively infinite amount of money from the perspective of you, making sure that that's a secure process. And so, yeah, it's a really good bet to use them in that instance, so long as you're very careful about your authentication to Google. And
Mhm.
that's where you have to be super careful.
Mhm.
And then you actually have to be careful. I'm always careful myself in just, what I will allow to connect into my own personal Google Cloud. I mean, I don't let things, you can get all these little apps. And as a security practitioner in general, I am very cautious about connecting things into my own Google Drive because sometimes I kind of don't know what these companies are. I can't, every time you do, you're entrusting access to that entity to your environment, and now you're depending on their security also. I trust Google, but do I trust all the things I can plug into Google? I don't think so. And
Right.
so I'm super cautious in that regard, actually. And for what we do, it's that multiplied by thousands because it's basically under the covers of the people building these SaaS applications on these cloud providers. And so it's even more complicated, actually.
Yeah, and so maybe let's dive into some of the different knobs that you can turn. You mentioned finding people permissions that aren't being used and just shutting those off. That's a pretty low-hanging fruit, I suppose.
Yes.
What are some of the other types of things that you can identify, some of the standard use cases where bad things could have happened, but you enabled a knob or a button to change
Yeah.
things? What are some examples of that?
Well, I gave one, and it's a good example one, which is basically, so now you're a developer building an application and you've got access to create an internet gateway.
Hmm.
So that's a permission that very, very, very few entities need for a very short limited time. But in an environment where they haven't gone to at least privilege or zero trust, and multiple people have that permission. So what does that mean? They could be sitting inside, somebody could get access to that permission. It could be a nefarious person, or it could be something which, a bad actor gets into the cloud. And as soon as a bad actor gets into the cloud, what do they want to do? They just move around looking for an ability to assume a role which has got identities. And then all of a sudden they can basically create an internet gateway, which is their pathway to get information out of your cloud. So that's
I
one example.
see.
There's services which are available in the cloud, which allow people to connect WAN connections into their Amazon environment. That's an example of a service. You don't want everybody getting access to that service. At the simplest, uh, another simple example is, permissions to deploy infrastructure into a region. And you have people in the US, and all of a sudden you've got willy-nilly permissions which allow them to deploy compute infrastructure into, other data centers inside these cloud providers. Well, then somebody can create a crypto miner and you wouldn't even know about it. And it starts
Right.
costing your company money.
That's
So
crazy.
it is crazy, and it happens. It absolutely, of course it happens.
Right.
And the more surreptitious one would be, yes, a crypto miner, it's bad. But really, if they create, just, somebody that's vacuuming up your information, something that actually also has the ability to just essentially create a virtual server, and they go do it, and they're using that server to just participate in your own infrastructure. They can do things like a ransomware attack. They can do all of these different things from inside your cloud. So the challenge with the power that you describe is true, but when you get to the scale of thousands, 3,000 to 4,000 permissions, it's just so bloody complicated. And
Hmm.
that's what we have to help our customers with.
Yeah, and of course APIs. APIs are the
Yes.
connectors of the world in the internet, and I've long wondered about these things. We did a show a few weeks ago with Kong, and Kong just rolled out an AI API gateway, as they call it, which I thought was very interesting because they figured out to leverage LLMs. Lots of companies, of course, go through the cloud, right? I mean, you
Yes.
could have one in-house, but probably 99% of the people who are using them are just using some cloud-based large language model. And what I thought was very interesting is they provide the capacity to build guardrails into their gateway such that you can, for example, prevent people from looking up politics on the
Yes.
show or looking up naughty things, for example. It's another place that you can install a guardrail basically. But I'm guessing that a big part of what you do as well is watch for APIs and API access and API behavior and that thing. Is that correct?
It is like, so a lot of listeners here would be very familiar with, of course, using apps on a phone or using apps and going to the website, right? So that's the interface to some SaaS application or function. But in reality, it's like a door. It's a front door into that function in whatever it is they're going to, whether it be a social media site or something else. But of course, underneath the covers, actually an app on your phone is actually using APIs to go get the information that you need. It's another door into the application. And behind that API then is all the things that support doing what the API wants to do. So everything is now API based. So everything is API based. So behind that API, we absolutely monitor. So for example, those APIs will be backed up by software roles, which have permissions to go get the information needed to solve the function that the API is trying to perform.
Right.
And like everything else, a lot of the times they may be over permissioned. And if they're over permissioned, we need to get them down to be correctly, basically right.
That's interesting.
Yes.
That's interesting. I'll throw another theory at you and just see what you think about this. I've paid close attention to Zoom and the work that they're doing, and I get the impression that they spend a lot of time and effort engineering around connectivity, especially Wi-Fi connectivity. Because, for example, if you have a shaky internet connection,
Yes.
you will lose the video before you lose the audio. And that I'm guessing that is a decision that was made. Let's prioritize at least the audio and the video will catch up later. But what I find interesting is that I feel like they've done some interesting work in basically talking to routers and understanding what's going on with routers and sensing when there are problems and being able to dynamically adjust and maybe dive into software-defined networking, right? We have software-defined storage, software-defined different things. Software-defined networking, I'm guessing, is dynamic in its nature in that it's watching for peaks and valleys, and then it's creating additional nodes if it needs to, or opening ports or doing other things like that.
Yes.
Is that something that you also get into? Because obviously the network is the river through which all this stuff flows, and being able to tap into that network is a pretty useful source of information.
You're actually, so we're not involved in the network aspect of this, which will be the definition and creation of software-defined networks. But actually, I do think you're actually touching on something which is absolutely true, which is the dynamic creation of infrastructure by code, which is what you're describing. And actually, I have no clue how Zoom does it, but I'm with you. Whatever they do clearly works better than other services. Because when other services, when you go to certain geographies, are like, God, it's so flaky. And Zoom somehow has figured out that they've done some really good stuff behind the scenes. Now, so there is an analogy. You're absolutely correct. What I think is the important thing is when we look to our future, when you look to AI and you look to the ability for software to create software, which is possible today, that this is like when you're creating an app in the cloud, very often it is software which is creating that Kubernetes that you just described, right? That actually just was created by software. And now as time goes on, that's just going to become more and more and more a reality for how we build things. And it's exceptionally dynamic. So it gets back to this absolute critical need. We got to watch and make sure those things can't just head off into some place that they shouldn't be going, because it's going to be so impossible for a human being to keep track of this.
Yeah, and before we get through the rest of this segment, I did want to dive into something else that you are tackling, which I think is crucial, and that is multi-cloud. Because Azure has its own way of doing things, Google has their way of doing things, Microsoft has their way of doing things. Well, I mean, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, right? They're the big ones, but there are other ones too. There's other ones out. Oracle is out there. There's a whole Heroku. There's a whole bunch of them. And to stay on top of what they do, how do you guys do that? I'm sure they provide notes on when changes occur and things of this nature. Like how dynamically can you stay on top of changes in these individual environments to make sure that you are aligned with them?
Yeah, this is absolutely the case. And of course, most companies have multiple cloud providers of some sort, even a little bit.
That's right.
But once you get a little bit in, now you're dealing with the complexity. You've no choice. You've got the entire thing in there. You got to basically figure out what you're going to deal with it. We actually, as an example, when we talk about this problem, we're specific in our cloud permissions firewall. We're analyzing, if I use AWS as an example, I'll just use that as an example. Every single day, we're watching for any new permission which shows up in any one of their services. Every single day. We automatically detect it. And then we automatically can either classify it. And if for some reason we can't automatically classify, we pop it up to one of our research analysts who basically says, okay, this is the implication of that. So this is really important. It's a big part of our cloud permissions firewall, which is okay, this thing is changing every day of the week, literally. And I now can deliver that part of my service, which is it's changing, but it's okay because we've got that under control. That is just something it's impossible for a customer to do, period. It's not their job.
Right.
They shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to deal with that. It's too complex. Now you add a second cloud into this. This is just human beings can't do this, Eric. They just can't. It's not going to work.
Hmm.
You got to have a
And
beautiful automated system for this.
right, and so you've created an abstraction layer, which is this
Yes.
permissions firewall that can connect to each one of these major environments and check what the controls are. And you mentioned when a new permission shows up, how does that show? How does that manifest itself? How do you see that there's a new permission?
Yeah, we'll see it through APIs and through how it is that Amazon is publishing new services or even new permissions. And so we'll have the old version and we'll see the new version. We'll do a comparison and we'll see that something new is coming. So it's
Interesting.
I mean, I actually think the cloud providers are very good at updating, for the most part, they're very good at updating what's new in their environment. It's just happening so quickly that nobody can keep track of it. And it's actually also happening across different teams in those companies because it's not just a cloud infrastructure, it's a cloud infrastructure, and each of them have hundreds of services which run on that infrastructure. And each of those services may be run by a different team. It's not like this is just one big coordinated, perfect thing. It's not actually. And so it's our job to do that coordination for the problem we're trying to solve, which is
Hmm.
our job is to understand the implications of permissions across every service and the implications of that to our customers. That's our job. That's basically what we do.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, well, it's important stuff because to your point, if you don't have the capacity to see what's happening in your environment, then bad actors can get in there and it can be, I mean, it could be weeks, it could be months, it could be years before someone figures out, hey, wait a minute, there's something going on here. What the hell is this thing that's chewing up all of our power and chewing up our bill? And what was the joke I heard that the most ungoverned line on your IT spend budget is your AWS bill? Right? It's just boop, it just goes up and down and you're like, what happened?
Complicated. It
Yeah.
is complicated because you have a lot of developers who are going in there just doing things. They're important. They're using the services. It gives them speed, and then all of a sudden, I know myself, we look and go, "Oh my God, what? Where is the spend going? Let's look. Let's look back at this service and make sure that we're, more judicious in our usage of it." It is very complicated for customers. There's no question. It is so complicated.
Yeah, and so how do you typically get through to clients? I got about a minute left for this segment. Are you going to conferences? Are you,
Yeah.
how do you reach out? How do you get to people?
We're actually reaching out. We're spending a lot of time, obviously, on social media. We've got a free trial available for our customers. We've really worked really hard to make this as simple as you could possibly imagine. Now, some customers may want to look under the covers, and we've some big, huge customers of ours, and so it's tested in big environments. Companies like World Connected and people like that. These are big enterprises. iCare Leaders is an example of a customer, and the reality is, so we reach them through free trials, we reach them through social media.
Product-led growth, baby. All right.
Absolutely. And actually, even though under the covers, it may be sophisticated, we actually want to make this literally get it up in an hour if you're a smaller organization, a couple of hours for discover your environment if not, and you can be clicking buttons, making a difference that first day, period.
That's
And
that's
before,
amazing.
some of this
That's
work would have
amazing.
taken months.
All right, stand by, folks. You're listening to Inside Analysis. Okay, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to Brendan Hannigan from Sonrai Security. That's Sonrai. Look these folks up online and did this new permissions firewall that they've rolled out because there are 42,000 different permissions, and most companies will have at least 4,000 of them, many of which are very important and deal with very sensitive information. And Brendan, my big question to you is on the data access side. A lot of times when there's trouble in hacks and in these environments, these cloud computing environments, it's because people get access to data. Now, yes, you can mask data, you can do all sorts of different things. You can encrypt it in motion, you can encrypt it where it sits, etc. There are lots of things you can do, but the fact is that if someone gets inside and they have access to the data, that gives them some capacity to do something bad. What
Yes.
do you do in your environment? What are some of the permissions that deal with data access inside these environments?
Well, part of it actually would be, so you're absolutely correct, which is, of course, if there's excessive access allowed to any data service or just any data in general, it's a huge risk. And the risk often, Eric, is that we always worry about insiders, so it's a valid worry that somebody inside a company goes rogue and does something. There's plenty of examples of that happening. But in reality, a lot of the risk also is just that there's a piece of malware, there's a piece of code which gets access to some role, permission, or some way, and that thing has access to the data. That's what they're looking for. And then, of course, they're able to, there's two things which happen then is they will figure out how to exfiltrate the data. And there's two things which we do there, right? So firstly, we can actually help our customers by limiting their access to data services that they just don't need. So one port of an infrastructure may need access to a data service, but the rest of them don't. So we can instantly eliminate access to that service, like a hard firewall level, like protection to say, you're not getting access to that data service, period. So that's one way you do it, because they just can't get access. So that's good. It's eliminating attack surface. And that's one example. The other thing which we can do is if, what they're trying to do next is if they do get access to data is exfiltrate the data, and we can absolutely just with one click, just boom, eliminate the ability for some of these roles to actually be able to exfiltrate the data, even if they get access to it. So that's the second thing which we can do, which is very generic. And then what you find is a third thing is there's lots of ways which are not obvious that people may be able to sort of move around to get access to data that's hidden. It's not obvious to anybody because of these, our environments are so complex. And so we can actually graph that all out and show customers the paths to data so that customers can say, wow, I didn't realize that many things could access my data. This is crazy.
Interesting.
I need to lock that down. So that's another aspect of something our company will help our customers understand. I think the basics are the most important, just shutting down unnecessary access to environments, to data services, and an ability to exfiltrate information.
Yeah, and then giving the capacity to turn something on, right? I mean, we just
Yes.
talked about this the other day on the show, and I learned this trick a decade ago from someone on this show who was talking about how if you want to see if something's being used, just turn it off and see if someone complains, right? If no one complains, well, guess what? No one was using that, right?
Yeah, well, we've learned this is an amazing thing. And this is again, think about it, they're pretty severe. What we've learned actually is we go to environments and we will go with customers and they will have anywhere from thousands to tens of thousands of, I call them entities for this discussion, but it's like identities and roles which haven't been used. And you just go, okay, just delete them. And people are really, really, really nervous to delete them. They really don't want to because they're afraid I'm going to delete this. And a minute later, I'm going to have people yelling at me left, right, and center. And you just go, but hang on a second, it hasn't been used for 6 months. So actually what we've done here, and that's just a reality. I can say to a customer till they're blue in the face what you just said, just delete it. But the fact is, they're not doing that. They're just not. So what we actually do in that instance is we came up with this concept and we figured out how to implement it. We call it quarantining. So what we do is for those unused users, we actually users, identities, roles, whatever it is, we just say, look, it hasn't been used for 6 months. So whatever your time period is, you picked a time period, it hasn't been used for that length of time. Quarantine it. What that means is it can't do anything. It's still there, actually, and it cannot do anything. But here's the magic. We call them zombies, actually, Eric. The magic of the zombie approach is if now one of those zombies actually wakes back up, because maybe it's an important thing which is used once every 18 months or something, which, by the way, is very rare. Most of the time, these things should just be deleted, but customers are nervous about it. What happens is then we get an instant notification that it's trying to do something. And within seconds, we can do something. We call it reanimate the zombie. We can put all the permissions back. No change. It's like nothing changed. And actually, our customers love that because there's a behavioral problem there, which is they're nervous to delete because they don't know everybody in their organization. They're afraid they're going to cause a problem. And so we basically said, don't worry about it. This is what's going to happen if they come back. And actually, our customers love that capability.
Yeah, well, there are a couple basic services, right, that are used for managing personnel and attaching permissions to them. The name is slipping my mind, but Microsoft has Active Directory, right? Active
Yes, of
Directory.
course. Yeah.
And so is that what you tie into? Is that your foundation, something like Active Directory?
We always will tie in with Active Directory, and people often will use Active Directory in Microsoft products. They actually often will actually be authenticating their developers into the cloud using Active Directory, even if it's an Amazon cloud, actually. So that's very common.
Right.
So we absolutely cover any entity which is coming in through Active Directory into these cloud environments. However, what you find in these cloud environments, and this is what the business is missing actually in general, is all of these non-people identities very often are being created through a different path through the development cycle, and Active Directory isn't keeping up with that. So we do. We actually cover it if it's coming into Active Directory, or we cover it if it's a role that's being used by software developers to go build infrastructure. We cover both. We're a central point which basically captures risk across both places.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, right? Because also in the development environment, you're testing things, you've got to test
Yes,
environments, and you're seeing it. So you want dummies basically to be able to access and make sure that all that stuff works. Well, that's a role. That is an entity which is
yes,
mimicking the behavior of a human being, even though it's not a human being, and that is an access point. So that
yes, it
has to
is.
be shut down. And does the developer shut it down when they're done? Oh, maybe they do, maybe they don't.
I mean, so here's the thing, and here's the sort of fallacy of this whole, of course, we want the developers to do a better job, and we need the developers, but we can't rely upon thousands of developers doing amazing work. We just can't. It's not, and sometimes we're asking them to do stupid things. They have other things they should be spending their time on. And what actually happens in that example is they're testing things, they're developing things. So they basically over permission things, then they do it, and then they never quite get to right permission it. They never quite get to it. And that's on the order of thousands and thousands of things all the time, Eric. And so
Right.
it's not happening. So people can say it should happen. It ain't happening. Developers aren't fixing this. We now have a way with a button, boom, it's fixed, and we do not disrupt those developers.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And the last topic I'll throw out here is something you mentioned, which is being able to show to the client like a graph of all
Yes,
the different access points to a certain system. There was a company I interviewed years ago. I was fascinated by these folks, Extra Hop. Are you familiar with those
yes,
guys?
of course. I remember Epic Shop, yeah.
And so what they do is they basically take they siphon off your network traffic and then they use it to create a digital twin of your entire environment. So you can
Yes,
see what's going where and which applications are being hit, which data is connected where. And that stuff is incredibly revealing, right? I mean,
yes, it is.
to someone who's maybe a bit reluctant, you show them that, you're like, oh, okay, I get it, right?
It is, and actually, so it's super analogous because now in the cloud, how do you move around? So, you siphon off data in the non-cloud world, and you can get access to network data in the cloud. It's like you can get access to that data, but the real power of how I move around and do things is identity access and permissions. And that
Right.
permission is what's allowing me to move to another role, to move to another account. I'm not going to learn that by looking at network traffic. I have to look at this fabric because that's how we can see how things could snake their way through the environment. So that's
Right.
basically, there's a nice analogy there. It's absolutely needed, and that's one of the issues what we've worked on is to try to do it in a way that's very consumable, which is the
Right.
diversity cloud permissions firewall, very consumable by very smart people, but people who don't have to be spending their entire days understanding the weirdness of these three different clouds and all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and security obviously is not one thing. I'll close with this funny quote. There was an Indian gentleman years ago I heard giving a presentation, and he said, "So basically, what I'm trying to say is lunch is not a food." And his point was that security is like lunch.
Yes.
It's a concept, but there are many different foods you can have in lunch. You can drink, you can have at a certain time, all these different things. His point is that there are lots of different things that go into security, obviously managing your passwords, permissions. And what I like about your approach here is that you've taken this holistic approach to create a layer of abstraction that deals both with the real people like Active Directory and all the machines. I think that's fascinating. Well, folks, look this gentleman up online. Brendan Hannigan is his name, and Sonrai Security, Sonrai Security is the company. Look up their permissions firewall. And if you want to be on the show, send me an email, info@insideanalysis.com. That comes straight to me. We'll talk to you next time, folks. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.